I'd like to introduce the members of our last panel for a discussion on the future of Asian power politics. Is President Trump gaining or losing ground for the United States? Doug Bandow is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties, and author of Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire. Previously, he served as a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan. Harry Kazianis is Director of Defense Studies at the Center for the National Interest and executive editor of its publishing arm, The National Interest. He is also a National Security Affairs Fellow at the Potomac Foundation. Colonel Douglas Macgregor is a decorated U.S. Army combat veteran, commentator, and author of 4 books, including Breaking the Phalanx, a new design for land power in the 21st century. And our moderator, Ben Friedman, teaches national security and strategic policy at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He is also a foreign policy fellow and defense scholar at Defense Priorities. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the panel.
Okay, thanks for staying until the end. And when you come to the end, you get to the future, which, as everybody knows, is Asia, where it's already tomorrow. So, East Asia. With that sort of Eastern moment, we'll turn to the content. The National Defense Strategy Commission, which is a congressionally mandated body that reviews our national defense strategy, came out with its review report on the national defense strategy 2 days ago, and they argue there that we're failing to adequately fund our national defense strategy, despite the $80 billion roughly year-to-year increase we had under Trump, and that as a result, we're losing ground in the great power competition that's supposed to be our focus now. As everyone knows, the National Defense Strategy says we're returning to an era of great power competition, which made many of us wonder where it went, if we lost it somewhere. But we're supposed to be returning to that, and the Commission report says we're losing ground, and as a result might lose a war, or could lose a war, or it's possible that we could maybe lose a war to China or Russia. So hopefully we'll get the panel's views on if that's right, how worried we should be about that. And I think what we'll do is we'll have each speaker give a 5-minute short answer to the panel question. Then I'll pose a couple questions and we'll go to audience Q&A. We'll go right to left. Doug, Harry, Doug. So Doug, number 1, go ahead.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's good to be with TAC and also my colleagues on the panel. I haven't seen Ben for a while, former colleague at Cato. These are obviously important issues that we're dealing with. You know, Asia is the future, we are all told, and I think in many ways that's an accurate judgment. You know, the question of the panel, are we gaining? The question, I suppose, is what does it mean to gain? You know, and how important is gaining as a goal? As elsewhere, the record, I think, for the administration is mixed. I mean, this president's views and his philosophy is not consistent. It shouldn't surprise us if the policy turns out to be rather inconsistent as well. In many ways, I think there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it's a bit hard to sort out which is which. I mean, Asia these days, in many ways, I think we could say Asia's kind of China and the others. I mean, China's the behemoth. China is the dominant power. China is presumed to be the potential peer competitor for the United States. It's in many ways, I think, a very different category from everyone else. And it has a huge number of issues, which the administration is addressing in different ways. I think for the president, economics dominates. If he has passions, it strikes me his passions are immigration and trade. And we see trade kind of to the fore in terms of a fairly active trade war. You know, there are serious issues there in terms of China's behavior in the international economic system. It's not clear to me the president has the right standards. He focuses on trade deficits, which essentially is an accounting fiction. It doesn't tell you very much. You know, while there are very important substantive issues in terms of China's behavior and how it manipulates the system, The question, how is this all going to turn out? Does the president actually have the right means? Approaching a nationalistic and very growing power and expecting them to publicly give in is not clearly a successful strategy there. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this turns out. It's very hard, I think, to predict what the future is going to be there. There's a lot of very bad human rights news on China, almost across the board, what's happening with academic exchanges, internet freedom, religious liberty, particularly the status of the Uyghurs. 1 million or more people in re-education camps. There's a lot of very bad stuff going on. America's ability to influence that is rather low. A group of international ambassadors came together to make a presentation to the Chinese government. Unfortunately, the U.S. was not among them, which I think was very unfortunate. That's an issue, not one the president has said very much about, but it certainly should concern us. And then the security issue, of course, where we see an awful lot in terms of the South China Sea, territorial disputes, America's allies, all of these through the South China Sea and in further Sea of Japan and elsewhere, lots of disputes out there, Paracel, Spratly, Scarborough Reef, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, etc. The U.S. has no particular claims there directly, but we believe in freedom of navigation, and we're certainly pressing the Chinese hard. I think the good news in terms of security is that from our standpoint, the issue here is not an existential threat. No one that I'm aware of actually believes China is going to mount an expedition to conquer Guam or conquer Hawaii. The issue, frankly, is the Chinese want to keep us out of their zone, and what they view as their zone. And it's certainly worth deciding how much America is willing to spend to defend its influence next to another rising great power. And I always tell people it's useful to flip it around. Imagine if the Chinese Navy was going up and down the eastern seaboard, was floating around the Caribbean, the Chinese were telling us how to handle our relations with Cuba, and there were extensive discussions in Beijing about potential war with the United States. My guess is not an awful lot of Americans would be saying nice things about the Chinese. They would be saying build missiles, build ships, build whatever it takes, but blow those suckers up if they come close to us. Okay. And I think we don't want that there, so I think this requires a very significant conversation in America, the difference between, I think, existential threats versus dominance versus influence. What are we prepared to fight for? What are we prepared to work with allies for? What do we want to be put off on others, burden shedding versus burden sharing, a lot of complicated issues there. And I think dealing with China, a big issue is how patient is the president. This is a huge issue that's not going to go away. This is not something that will be solved during his term. Beyond that, there are an awful lot of issues. Even if China is the big one, the others matter. North Korea, I think the president deserves credit. He's helped transform that issue. Again, I think patience is critical. I personally do not believe the North Koreans will give up their nuclear weapons. On the other hand, I do believe that Kim Jong-un may very well want a different relationship and is interested in turning North Korea into a somewhat responsible power that may be a nuclear power. And if we can live with India and with Pakistan and with Israel and with other countries with nuclear weapons, we probably can figure out how to live with the North Koreans. But I do think the president deserves credit here, even though I worry about his expectations. Japan is doing more in the region. It's being driven a bit by the activities of China and North Korea. I would like to see us encourage them to do more. The only way to do that, I think, is for us to do less for their own security. Questions were raised earlier about Pakistan. The whole India-Pakistan issue is an extraordinarily important one, also a rather dicey one given those difficult relationships and the instability within Pakistan in particular, and other issues out there, Southeast Asia, Australia, and more. This is a very complex region with a lot on the table. I'll throw out very quickly, I think, thoughts for the future. One is, how important is Asia versus other priorities? We have to make decisions. We have to make trade-offs. The U.S. cannot afford to be dominant everywhere. The U.S. is bankrupt. We have $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. In 5 or 10 years, interest payments will be greater than our payments for national defense. The question is, are we prepared to defund Medicare so we can save the Europeans money in defending their welfare states? These are decisions we're going to have to make, and the question is, does Asia come out number one? If it does, it suggests less for Europe. It suggests less for the Middle East. We just had a panel on the Middle East. We see those issues there. I think in many ways the question is less gaining and simply not losing things that are critically important and making decisions on what those critically important things are. And the question of also, how do we turn from burden sharing to burden shedding? Who should defend South Korea? Maybe it's the folks who have 50 times the GDP and twice the population of the northern neighbors. That is South Korea. Maybe they can have the troops there. Why do we have troops there? These are things I think we have to expand the conversation well beyond from where we're at today. So Asia, lots going on. I think the president has done some things right. But as always, even when he gets things right, there are parts of it that he gets wrong. He gives us an awful lot to talk about. I will stop there.
Okay. Eric.
All right. Well, thanks to TAC. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Great panel. Great to have Doug and Doug and everybody here. This is excellent. So I want to tackle this a little bit differently. I want to basically take the question head on, and I think you'll see my comments are pretty similar to Doug's in a lot of ways. My own opinions on Asia have changed quite a bit over the last few years. I probably would have been the hawk on this panel even up to about a year ago, but getting closer to 40 now, maybe I'm just getting a little bit softer, I don't know, but there it is. So, question on the table. Is Trump gaining or losing ground for the United States in Asia? Well, how do you define gaining or losing ground? What is the Trump administration's goal? What's our strategy to attain that goal? For me, the goal as I perceive it is really two things. I think it's pretty simple. It's a hard containment of China, and I think second, the removal of all of North Korea's nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Pretty straightforward. However, when you say that out loud, there's an obvious problem. Even if you think you can achieve one of those two things, you can't do both. You can only try to do one or the other. That's pretty much a very tall order to achieve. Also, we aren't thinking through the ramifications of these goals. What are we willing to risk? What are the consequences? And if we are willing to send men and women to die for these goals, how are we supposed to try to achieve them? I mean, we've risked a lot in the Middle East. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars there. Are we really willing to do this all over again in Asia? For places on the map that, to be quite frank with you, a lot of Americans can't even find. So I think these are important questions that we're really not asking. So let me do this. Let me go through each one of these goals, how we're trying to achieve them, and bring up some questions I think we all really need to ponder in the months and years to come. So first, let me take this whole idea of a hard containment of China. I really think it's an evolution of where the Obama administration was trying to pivot to the Asia Pacific, or renamed the rebalance. To be quite frank with you, I think it was really a soft containment strategy. And I don't think it went very well. I think for obvious reasons, it just didn't work out. I mean, when the United States is trying to do things in the Middle East, in Syria, over Ukraine, I mean, all of our priorities were basically all over the place. If you're trying to pivot or rebalance to one area, you have to make it a priority. The other thing is, you really can't do that if you're in the middle of budgetary crises, sequestration. Those things really hurt your focus. So this is one of the reasons why I don't think the pivot worked out very well. But here comes the Trump administration, and I think right before they took office, it was very clear that they were going to attempt this, what I would call a hard containment. President Trump took a call from Taiwan's president. That was a really big deal that I think that's forgotten about today. I think that set up where this was eventually going to go. But as we know, President Trump has his first meeting with President Barack Obama, and in the Oval Office, Barack Obama breaks the news to Donald Trump. North Korea is going to be your biggest foreign policy problem in the months and years to come. North Korea is going to test or is going to have long-range missiles that can hit the U.S. homeland. Now, thinking about that very logically, if your goal is to try to stop North Korea from gaining those capabilities, guess what? You're going to need China's help to do that. And that's where the whole maximum pressure campaign comes in. Problem. How are you going to contain China if you need North Korea, you need their help on North Korea? That's going to be a very tough thing to do. So you have two goals that are basically in opposite of each other. So what the Trump administration did, pretty obvious, is they delayed this whole containment strategy. They looked for China's help. They conducted the maximum pressure campaign. But we all know that today that maximum pressure campaign, whether the administration likes it or not, is falling apart. I mean, there's been reporting from Radio Free Asia going back to May that there's a lot of evidence it's falling apart. There was reports out today in Reuters that there's a lot of problems with it. So we know where that's going. So there's some obvious challenges there. I think when we think about North Korea, which is the second part of this, I think we have to think about what our goals are realistically. And if your goal is to try and get North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons after they've been working on this really since the 1950s, I think it's a foolish goal. Now, I would have been very upset about anybody saying that even a year ago, to be honest with you. But to be honest with you, I think it's very realistic. I mean, if you look at the amount of resources and capabilities that the North Koreans have put into this, they're not going to give those weapons up. And that's unfortunate, that's a tragedy, but that's not the Trump administration's fault. There's a lot of people who are to blame for that situation, going all the way back as far as you want to go. You can go back as far as Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush. But guess what? We deal with a lot of countries that have nuclear weapons, as Doug has already said. Russia has nuclear weapons. China has nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean that you just refuse to not deal with them. So I think if we have a more realistic approach, there's a lot of things that we can do when it comes to North Korea. And what I would point everybody to is to what South Korea is actually doing today. The South Koreans, if you talk to their different, ambassadors or top-level officials in Seoul, what they will tell you is, yes, we are worried that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but this is something we've dealt with for almost a decade. We're not comfortable with it, but at the same time, we're not just going to throw our relationship away with them or what could be a relationship with them because of it. And something the mainstream media has really missed over the last couple weeks and months is there's a lot of things that have happened to really lower tensions on the Korean Peninsula. After the Third Korean Summit, there was agreements that came out that have deconfliction zones, no-fly zones near the demilitarized zone. North Korea and South Korea are starting to really have progress in their relationship. Are we really willing to throw all of that away? I don't think so, to be honest with you. I don't think that's a very smart idea. So I think these are things that we really need to start thinking about. I think in terms of China, I think there's something else that we need to really throw in this equation. I really do think China has peaked as a power. One of the things that has allowed China to become really the world's factory is demographics. They had a massive demographic advantage where they were able to put a lot of cheap labor into factories to build the world's products that we love. I mean, go to Walmart. You can get your LCD TV, your toys, your clothes, dirt cheap. Well, in the months and years to come, that's going to be very hard for China to pull off. This is why their GDP is not growing at 9 or 10% a year. It's really growing at 6%, and some are thinking it's only growing at maybe 1 to 2%. If China has peaked, what does that say for our strategy? We're not thinking about any of these things, and I think it's time that we really do start thinking about them. Thank you.
Is this working?
There you go.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to join you today. First, let me preface my remarks with a couple of things. First, I am very happy that I was not on the last panel. My God, what a depressing hour that was. There was no good news. I'm going to try and deliver what I think is some good news in a second. The second thing that shocks me beyond belief is that Harry Kazianis admits that he buys toys at Walmart. I would never do such a thing. I can't believe it. It's out of the question. I would never admit to it. I don't go to Walmart. I'm not a Walmart person. Okay. I have a very different view from my two colleagues for various reasons. First, I do not see China as this aggressive military power bent on invading and conquering its neighbors. I see no evidence for that at all. What little I do know about the Chinese military suggests to me that they aren't very good. Historically, they never have been, and that they would make a mess out of anything they tried to do on their borders because all of their neighbors hate them and are suspicious of them and will fight them. Okay, so that's the first thing. I don't see any requirement to contain anybody. Now, there is an analogy I use to try and make this point, and bear with me. For many, many years, the Koreans used to say that we are a minnow between two whales. Well, I've changed that. China is indeed a whale. It's a large blue whale flopping around in the deep ocean trying to keep itself fed. Right now, it's approaching the shores. It's in shallow water and is afraid of being beached. I'll talk about that in a second in terms of the economics. Then you have Japan. Japan is a powerhouse, ladies and gentlemen. It is a killer whale. It is greater, more powerful, more potent, and potentially more influential strategically today than at any point in its history. It needs absolutely nothing from us except friendship. Then there is Korea, South Korea. I'm talking about the Republic of Korea. If there's a minnow, the minnow is up north. The third whale is not a whale, it's a great white shark, and that is the Republic of Korea. 49 million Koreans have an economy that is larger than Russia's. These are the three great economic powerhouses in the region, and what they decide to do or not to do, whether or not they get along, these things are vital in terms of global prosperity, global economic stability, and ultimately global peace. Where do we fit in? And I'm going to argue that we really don't. And I think Donald Trump understands that. I think Donald Trump has always understood that it is in our interest in most cases to disengage our armed forces from most of the world. And that is certainly true today in Asia. I hear constantly about the dangers in the South China Sea, and I hear it almost inevitably from the United States Navy and the Marine Corps, both of whom see a China threat picture as absolutely vital and essential to the survival of those services and their World War II force structures, to be blunt. We have 3 Marines in charge right now. We have the White House Chief of Staff, who's a Marine. We have the Secretary of Defense, who is a Marine. We have the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's a Marine. Why is that important? Because they understand that the moment those 32,000 U.S. Army forces are withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula, the 19,000 plus Marines in Okinawa have no mission. Frankly, they don't have any mission now as it is, but they'll have absolutely no excuse once those troops are pulled out. Why? Because after the Cold War, there was a discussion, how do we justify the Marines in the Pacific? And the answer was supplied by General Colin Powell, who said, well, we'll make them the reserve for the Army on the peninsula. They'll be the backup. If there's a war, they're going to go over and reinforce the Army. So they got to stay in Okinawa. Everybody in Japan wants us to leave. We don't need to be there. They know that. If they add 1% to their gross national product, they will be number 2 or 3 in the world in terms of investment in military power. So there's no requirement for us to be there. Finally, this brings me to this other issue, which is China itself. Yes, China is in the middle of a slowdown. If you look carefully at the decisions that were made to confer extraordinary power on President Xi, those were not accidental. The Chinese have a history that doesn't exist in Korea or Japan. It's called dynastic change. Dynastic change in China usually comes about when people can't eat. Now, we find that incomprehensible, but that is a ever-persistent nightmare in the minds and the eyes of the leadership of China. One of the great achievements of the Communist Party of China was to finally reach a point where they could feed everyone. They're very concerned about this downturn. They're concerned about lack of employment. They're concerned about masses of people milling around the great cities on the coast that now have nothing to do. And they are also concerned about the fact that much of the prosperity in China has not penetrated inland. They worry about these things, and that's one of the reasons that President Xi is cooperative. He's cooperative with President Trump, and he's cooperative with Seoul and Tokyo. He has now told the Japanese something that the Japanese have always wanted, access to Chinese markets. If you go back through the last several hundred years of wars between Japan and China, they were inevitably fought over access to Chinese markets, and the Chinese would keep them out. Xi has now turned around and said, we welcome you. We will have you as a partner in the One Road, One Belt program. There is no reason for Japanese-Chinese hostility. And the Japanese know it and the Chinese know it. Now, will this come off exactly as everybody hopes? I don't know, but I think the outlook is very positive. And then finally, there's this thing in Korea. I do not share the view that North Korea is this impregnable, invincible fortress armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. In fact, I'm someone who thinks that the alleged nuclear capability up there is grossly exaggerated. I know enough about rockets and missiles to tell you that all of their rockets are liquid-fueled. No one other than the Three Stooges today would launch a liquid-fuel rocket. It's too damn dangerous. They're all old Soviet rockets. And this rocket that supposedly could reach us is an old Soviet rocket that was recently extended in terms of its size and capability to give it longer range. But none of these rockets have ever mounted a warhead. And if you put a warhead on these things, the range drops off precipitously. There are real questions about whether or not they have any nuclear warheads they could mate with a missile. We've never seen any evidence for it. So there's much that's imputed to them that I think is wrong. And then finally, I truly believe that we are going to watch something happen. We're going to discover that North Korea does not survive contact with South Korea. It's not going to survive. Now, is it going to end with a bang? I hope not. I rather suspect it may end with a whimper. We already have credible reports coming out of North Korea that there is enormous discontent. And this discontent stems from the fact that large numbers of people in the North actually do know what exists in the South. And these joint industrial zones are viewed as manna from heaven, the opportunity to get in there and improve. So these are my opening remarks because my time's up.
All right. So let's focus for a moment, if we can, on China. I'll ask a question, and at the risk of editing the title of our panel, why not holding ground? Why isn't there an option of the United States as holding ground in Asia? And isn't that our policy goal forever? Haven't we been a status quo power? And further, isn't Asia designed geographically and in the distribution of power, which Doug Macgregor mentioned, to have a sort of stable balance of power given the water between states? I mean, isn't it maybe the case that as much as more than China's gaining, defense is gaining in Asia because of the technology? So everybody can take a shot at that from the same way we did the opening remarks.
I think that Doug's absolutely right in terms of China. This is not the 800-pound gorilla. There's an awful lot that can go wrong there. People talk about China growing old before it grows rich. I mean, the demography is all off. They have extraordinary challenges in terms of their economy. Lots of state-run enterprises, bad banks. I think the challenges internally are extraordinary. I mean, young people are very nationalistic, but they don't like the controls. I think in many ways, Xi strikes me as being both on the summit and the precipice. The question of how this works out, I think, is very uncertain, which I think is why patience is worthwhile. That this is a country that's been at war with most of its neighbors at one point or another. It's had conflict with Vietnam, with Korea, with India, with Russia, with Japan. Its geopolitical situation is difficult. So I think that the good news is that just as they hope they can deter us, they can be deterred. And there's a lot of construction of submarines and things going on in the region, and that's not for the U.S., it's for China. And that's all to the good.
Let me take on this issue of holding ground. I mean, as being executive editor of National Interest, I obviously have a fair look at media and how traffic goes into our website. Let me tell you one thing. When we put up articles about weapons and strategy and bombs, those are what gets the traffic. When we put up articles about restraint and not doing something and more pragmatic approaches, they do not get as much traffic. And the way I sort of look at this in terms of holding ground is, as a country, that's not what we do. I mean, think about how our media cycle works. Think about how social media works. Action is praised. Doing something is praised. And that goes into our foreign policy. I mean, if you think about our debates about Iran today, or just different, Russia, all these great power problems, China, everything's about doing something, pushing back. This is the problem that we have with our conference in a lot of ways. We're talking about realism. We're talking about restraint. Those are good ideas. Those are ideas that are very near and dear to my heart. The thing that we all need to do is we need to figure out ways to operationalize those ideas. We need to figure out ways, essentially, to make them as sexy as action, because action is the thing that everybody respects. So I think when we're talking about holding ground, or maybe not pushing back against China because maybe they could fall apart or maybe they have peaked, we have to figure out ways to talk about those strategies and make them, as like I said, as sexy as action. That's a challenge. That's a media problem. To be honest with you folks, I don't have a good solution, but it's something that I think if we are going to push this realism and restraint mantra forward, we have to figure out a way to solve it. So maybe go a little off topic, but I think that really gets to the heart of the matter.
Now, you've just explained why my stuff doesn't sell very well.
It does. You do well. You're on TV. You do fine.
I would put it this way, again, using an analogy, because we tend to mix up Russia and China. One of the things that people don't understand is that the Russians, although you hear about NATO expansion and so forth, are truly far, far more concerned about Japan and China than they are about anyone in Europe or NATO. And I think it's important to understand the difference between the two. Whereas China is a giant international business conglomerate that wants to open subsidiaries all across Asia and rapidly overwhelm its potential competitors, control all the markets, and exploit all the resources, which it cannot do because it's got a problem with Japan as a principal competitor in Southeast Asia, and the Japanese are far more popular in Southeast Asia and Malaysia and Indonesia and these places than China is. Russia is very different. Russia is sort of like an elderly gentleman with a bipolar disorder who lives in an old house in a bad neighborhood. And over the years, he's accumulated large numbers of weapons, which he keeps handy because he's absolutely convinced that all of his neighbors hate him and want to break into his house. He's half right. Everybody hates him. That's true. But nobody wants to break in. On the other hand, there are large numbers of Russians in the basement who are all trying to break out. Okay. So that's the difference between China and Russia. And we fail to understand that. And we sort of assume, I mean, I saw this article today, we have to spend more money on defense as usual because China and Russia together could defeat us. Well, you would think that someone would have had the brains to say, perhaps it's in our long-term interest to ensure that they don't feel the need to do that, number one. But number two, if you think that the Russians are going to rush into the Chinese arms or vice versa in order to go to war with us, you've lost it. That's not the case. If you look at China, for instance, they have a no first use policy. They've made that very clear. They don't have that many nuclear weapons, but they have enough to ensure that if you attack them, they can destroy you. And that's all they're interested in. They're not interested in going to war with anybody because privately they know they're not very good. I tell people all the time, and if there are any Marines in the audience that have served in Asia, they can confirm this. If you landed the Japanese army today on the coast of China, it would go through the Chinese today the way they did 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago. That's how good the Japanese are. That's how weak the Chinese are. Why doesn't that happen? Well, first of all, the Japanese went on a learning experience. Invading that place is absurd. It's crazy. If we went to war with China, the war with China would look like siege warfare. It would be like standing outside a giant fortress and then lobbing rocks into the place. You'd be there forever because they got plenty of water and food, and they can take the losses. It's a huge waste of time. This whole air-land battle business that got so much attention here was just sheer insanity. But as I was told by a friend of mine who's a 3-star in the Air Force, don't worry, Doug, this is really an acquisition program for the Air Force and the Navy. I said, I knew it!
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned nuclear weapons because in speaking of this commission report saying we might lose a war to China, I can't believe people can get to the end of a sentence about the prospect of a U.S.-Chinese war and not mention that war might end in Armageddon, which means it's almost certainly not going to happen, in my opinion. But I'm not on the panel. I just asked the questions. I was going to ask something about Korea. But I think I'll go to the audience instead and see what everybody wants to talk about in our remaining 13 minutes. So step right up. Who has a question? Yes, sir. Over there.
Hello? Very good. So I think something that Colonel Macgregor mentioned that was quite interesting is the relative strength of South Korea in East Asia. The current prospect of a rapprochement between North Korea and South Korea, some think actually has been of concern to Japan because it makes likelier the further expansion of the Korean manufacturing base and Korean economy and a further threat to Japanese economic competition in Southeast Asia. Any thoughts from the panel about the interplay between Japan, the U.S., and China on policy in the Korean Peninsula moving forward?
Well, I certainly think that both Japan and China would prefer not to see a united Korea. They might not articulate that in public, but that's probably what they would view as their interest. The Chinese certainly don't want a united Korea allied with America and U.S. troops on their border. It's not clear they could stop it, but I think that certainly would concern them. I think that we see China has taken a different position towards North Korea this year. My supposition is out of fear that North Korea might cut a deal with the U.S. I mean, for 6 years, Xi refused to meet with Kim Jong-un. There were no invitations to come visit. High-level delegates didn't come. And then suddenly we've had 3 summits. That you get a sense, because North Korea has always been very independent, has played the Soviets versus the Chinese, and I think actually would like to have a good relationship with the U.S. in part because the distant balancer can help them and give them space. And the Chinese realize that, and I think that's one of the reasons they're undercutting the question of maximum pressure. They suddenly understood we have to make some overtures to the north. So I think that adds complexity. And the idea of reunification, I don't know how North and South, the point is the North Koreans don't want reunification in terms of political leadership. I mean, they would be swallowed, as they put it to me when I visited. And the South Koreans have their own concerns in terms of cost, political implications of bringing in so many people who've grown up in a socialist system. So, I mean, all those regional powers have a lot of interest at stake. They get very nervous looking at the peninsula.
Very briefly, talking with the Koreans who actually are in the joint economic zones where they are exposed to Korean labor from the north, have all consistently told me that the gratifying news is that the North Koreans are not like the Germans from the east or the Poles or the Czechs or the Slovaks. They're not lazy. They want to work, desperately want to work. They view this as a golden opportunity to not simply improve their lives, but to build relationships with the people in South Korea. So again, I think that if you look at President Moon and my limited exposure to the Koreans over the years at the elite level, particularly the people who are there right now, they are acutely sensitive to China, acutely sensitive to Beijing. And I don't see any evidence that once these 2 states are integrated, which I think will happen in our lifetimes, that there will be any interest in any aggressive moves vis-a-vis China. I simply don't see any evidence for that. I think quite the opposite. I think the concern right now is that we in the South are dangerous. We have general officers, it's similar to the Navy that keeps talking about the South China Sea and showing those Chinese and so forth. Nobody ever mentions Vietnam and its fortified islands or its extremely oppressive authoritarian regime, far worse in terms of human rights than anything going on in China, in my judgment. Nobody ever mentions that. It's all about China, China, China. You have a similar situation with the Army. Well, if this falls down we got to go north. Well, that's insanity. Absolutely not. We need to get out of the way. We need to sign a treaty. This is the key to everything. A treaty that absolutely unambiguously ends the Korean War. Beijing wants it, Pyongyang wants it, Seoul wants it, because the people in Beijing, and to a lesser extent Pyongyang, because to be blunt, if the emperor in Beijing wants it to happen, it's a done deal. So the people in Pyongyang are along for the ride whether they like it or not. And they want absolute assurance that we will not launch a military operation to change the regime. Now, we may sit back and say, well, that's silly, but look at our record. Mm-hmm. Look at our rhetoric. They absolutely worry about that. So you've got to sign the treaty. Then you've got to turn the Combined Forces Command, which is command of all the armed forces on the peninsula, over to the Koreans. And then you need to start getting out. Now, that schedule of departure, that can be linked to any number of measures that you think are important to the United States, particularly in connection with the nuclear material. But we have to be careful when we go north, and I've had Koreans tell me this. Once you see what they have and you discover it's not much, you don't say that. Do you understand that? You must not do that. We're stupid. We don't understand people anywhere. We think everybody is like us. And if they're not like us, they should be. Mm-hmm. It's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. We have been there long enough, ladies and gentlemen. We need to get out. There's ways to do it that make sense. I think it can work. But you got a lot of people in the Pentagon who are going to fight like hell to stop this. And they have to be dealt with.
Okay, a couple more questions. No speeches, by the way. That's our job. Yes, sir, number 1, and then we'll get to you guys, hopefully.
Thank you. I like what you said, Doug. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Reagan Foundation. I'm a Japan native U.S. citizen. My question is, I've been thinking about a balance of power in the Pacific region. I'm talking about rising China. Is it possible? I'm sure it's possible, but if it is, how?
Balance of power.
Oh, I think it is. Look, the Japanese, this is another interesting group of people that we don't understand. Japan is ready to be Japan on its own. It's tired of the sort of 70-year apology tour that the Germans are still on. The Japanese are ready to do things, but the Japanese are not stupid people. They've learned enormously from the last 200-300 years of history. They're not interested in embarking upon that. If you look at their policies in Asia, they are achieving today, right now, with their South strategy down to Southeast Asia, everything they wanted during World War II. They enjoy enormous economic influence and power. The Malays want them in. And again, this is something else most Americans don't understand. We've been fed this steady diet of everyone in Asia hated the Japanese. They were all evil. Not necessarily. Not in Malaysia. Not in Indonesia. Even in the Philippines, in many cases, people were very happy to see the white men go away. They saw themselves at the time, not unreasonably, as liberating Asia from Europeans. Now, that's in the past, but it's important to understand that the Japanese do have fertile ground to build economic relations with other people. I don't know that the Japanese need a nuclear capability, but they may well develop it at some point, simply as a deterrent, to ensure that they cannot be taken on and destroyed unilaterally by anybody. And finally, there's a spoiler in all of this, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. It's Russia. Russia loses in Northeast Asia with what's happening on the peninsula. Russia loses with what's happening in Japan. Russia loses given the relationship that we are having with China, because Trump is going to see this tariff war come to an end. The Chinese want it to end. We want it to end. It's not helpful. We'll come to some new modus vivendi. The Russians will lose because the Russians depend heavily on the use of North Korea's leverage against Japan and Korea. And as I pointed out before, they don't trust China. So the Russians are going to be losers. The smartest thing the Russians could do right now is to give the Kuril Islands back to Japan. Very smart move. They're doing the opposite. And they're shoving this right into the face of the Japanese. They're fortifying those islands. They've got missiles and rockets on them. This is a dumb thing to do. But as I told you before, you're dealing with the bipolar old man in the house. They think differently. That doesn't mean there'll be a war. It doesn't mean they want one. It's the way they think.
Let me just quickly jump on that. I think a balance of power is ideal. Just getting back to this whole hard containment situation with China, another question we're not asking here. What happens if we do successfully contain China? What does that look like? Are we talking about a China that's broken up into pieces? Are we talking about regime change? Are we talking about a Chinese democracy that might actually even be more nationalistic than the China that we're dealing with now? Again, we need to ask the questions. We're not asking the questions, and we might not like the answers we get. So I think it's important.
Another balancing power is India, which is playing a role and very important.
I don't think so.
Okay, we'll take the questions 1 and then 2 in a row so the panel can answer the questions as they see fit together. Yeah, so the gentleman over there, or we can go here first and then there, it doesn't matter. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say I've enjoyed very much what I've heard about the powers of East Asia and what you've told me about them. One I have not heard about, and so my question is, whither Taiwan?
Good. Glad you mentioned that. Okay.
Okay. First of all, if you're in Tokyo.
Sorry, let's take the other questions so we can
okay,
answer them in
okay.
tandem.
Sure. Gareth Porter, independent investigative journalist. I want to ask a question that follows up on comments that have been made both by all three panelists, I guess. It has to do with the way in which the news media has covered the U.S.-North Korean nuclear peace talks and has assumed as a matter of fact that is not to be questioned that North Korea will not give up any nuclear weapons. And in light of some of the comments, particularly by Doug, my question is whether we're dealing here with potentially with a major myth that could be highly destructive of the chances for peace, because the North Koreans have a strategy. I'm positing the possibility the North Koreans have a strategy of being willing to give up whatever they have, and Doug may be right that it may be extremely limited, only if and when the United States reaches the point of dropping the degree of hostility that has shown toward the regime in the North thus far over a period of decades. And this, obviously, this attitude has been reinforced by the news media coverage, and it makes it very likely that politically the United States cannot reach an agreement with North Korea that is acceptable because of that. And so my question is the problem primarily North Korean reluctance to give up a nuclear weapon or its nuclear weapons, or is it primarily that the United States government, political system, is incapable right now of reaching peace with North Korea?
Okay, so we got 2 questions in 1 minute and 3 answerers. So we'll go. We can start with Doug Macgregor.
One thing to keep in mind is if you're sitting in Tokyo and you draw a circle that you call your defense perimeter, Taiwan is part of that perimeter. If the Chinese were ever to attack Taiwan and land there, they would be at war with Japan. Same thing is true with the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese will not sit quietly and watch the Chinese overwhelm Korea. So I think we tend to view everything through our own lens and what we think is important. This is another reason why I don't think we need to be in Northeast Asia at all at this point. We have a partner in Tokyo. We ought to work with that partner and get out militarily. The second question was about the nuclear weapons. Look, again, I go back to what I said before. Sign the peace treaty and commit to no forcible regime change. Turn over the CFC. And I think you will be pleasantly surprised at the rapidity with which the North Koreans cooperate with the South Koreans. But we then need to leave.
Let me just touch on Garrett's question, because I think it's a great question, something we missed in this panel. I don't know if anybody, well, I'm sure some of you saw that the New York Times article that came out on Monday that was talking about these 13 missile bases that were previously undisclosed. Let me tell you something. The New York Times did everyone a disservice. It wasn't the article. It was the headline, the great deception or whatever deception it was. There was no deception. The Trump administration did not sign any sort of agreement that got rid of those bases. The North Koreans, in fact, told us on January 1st, when Kim Jong-un gave his New Year's Day address, that they were going to, quote unquote, mass produce nuclear weapons and missiles. They told us that they were going to do that. The news media in that story should have been ashamed of itself. These are trends that are changing the narrative, that are pushing us towards a conflict with North Korea, and it does not have to happen. There's a way out, just very quickly. There is a deal on the table that could happen. When I was in South Korea back in September during the third Inter-Korean Summit, there was a lot of talk about the North Koreans giving up or dismantling the Yongbyon nuclear facility in exchange for a peace declaration. That is a really good first step and a foundation towards some sort of peace regime. We should jump on it.
I think I would not underestimate the nationalistic implications of Taiwan, including young people. They may like democracy, they may like the free internet, but they believe that Taiwan is China's. And this is not something that's going to go away. I think it's extraordinarily difficult and potentially very combustible. I think the question for us is, can we help arm the Taiwanese so they can make any conquest attempt to be very expensive? But I think a war over that could be very dangerous, and I think the Chinese have a lot more interest in it than us, which makes it a very dangerous situation. I think the question on Korea is very important. Actually, Harry has a piece of mine up on the website now that makes an argument on this. The North Koreans have been very explicit that their policy of nuclear weapons, I was there last year, and I've talked to their diplomats in the U.S. since, that their nuclear program is a response to America's hostile policy. They've been very explicit about that. And they have said, the Supreme Leader, as he is styled, has said, and the June summit declaration all say, number one, the North wants a better relationship with the U.S. Number two, the North wants a peace regime. Number three, denuclearization. And the argument makes a lot of sense, frankly, if you look at what happened to poor Muammar Gaddafi. And the North Koreans watched that. And if you want to know what happened to Muammar, you go to YouTube and you can find out what happened when he was pulled out of the culvert by the mob. And it was not very pleasant. And Kim Jong-un never wants that to happen to him. So I think it's critical. I think Harry's right that we can come up with kind of quid pro quos, but we should be responding to that. If we believe they're willing to give up nuclear weapons, we have to listen to what they say is the process that matters to them, that they can trust us before they give them up. And I think we should respond to that.
Okay, that concludes our panel, and it remains only to thank everybody, so please help me.
Thanks for coming out today. A couple brief announcements before you leave. There's still quite a few boxed lunches over there, so if you're still hungry, please take one on your way out. And secondly, if you like what you heard today, please visit theamericanconservative.com and follow us on Twitter at AmconMag. Thank you.
Did you really?